My name is Quinn. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as the steady one, the calm wife, the dependable professional, the person who doesn't make things messy. I live a life that, from the outside, looks organized and quietly successful. I work with words for a living, but I've always been more comfortable listening than speaking. People often mistake that for softness, or worse, for not noticing. If you met me before everything changed, you might have thought I was lucky. Married to a man people trusted, a relationship that seemed thoughtful, mature, and drama-free. I was often described as grounded, low maintenance, or easygoing. Those labels sound flattering, but they came with an assumption that I didn't need much, didn't question much, and wouldn't push back. This is not a story about rage. It's not about revenge, exposure, or public collapse. It's about clarity, about the slow, quiet realization that the life I thought I was building was resting on something false. I learned my husband had been lying since before the wedding. Not all at once, not in a way that made headlines, but in a way that rearranged my understanding of myself. The marriage started with a secret. I didn't know that when I said yes. I didn't know it when I stood beside him, smiling for photos, believing I was stepping into a partnership based on mutual truth. What I knew, what I thought I knew, was carefully curated. And that curation didn't stop after the wedding. It simply became more efficient. What you'll hear in this story is not a sequence of explosive moments. It's a progression. Small signals, dismissed instincts, the normalization of being talked over, reassured, redirected. You'll hear how silence can be mistaken for ignorance and how patience can be misread as permission. You'll hear how someone can be underestimated not because they lack awareness, but because they don't perform it loudly. I'm telling this now because time has passed, because perspective has settled, and because there's value in documenting how quiet dominance actually works, not as control over others, but as sovereignty over oneself. I won't exaggerate events to make them sharper. I won't frame myself as a hero or him as a caricature. This is about honesty, not drama. If you stay with me, you'll hear how I move from confusion to certainty without confrontation, how I learn to observe instead of react, how preparation can happen invisibly, and how the most irreversible decisions are often made without raising your voice. This story isn't meant to tell you what to do. It's meant to show you what noticing looks like, especially when you've been taught to doubt your own perceptions. So before we begin properly, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever felt that something important in your life was off, even though everything looked fine from the outside? Before I understood the full shape of the lie, I knew exactly who I was to other people. I was the reasonable one, the wife who didn't interrupt, the woman who remembered birthdays, smoothed over awkward moments, and handled logistics quietly in the background. When friends described me, they used words like solid or dependable. At dinners, I was often seated next to whoever needed calming. At gatherings, I was handed coats, phones, children, and secrets. I carried things well. That became my reputation. My husband liked that about me. Or rather, he liked what it allowed him to be. He was the talker, the storyteller, the man people leaned toward. When he spoke with confidence, sometimes with certainty that outpaced facts, but no one challenged him. Not publicly, and certainly not me. When we were together, people looked to him for answers and to me for confirmation. I nodded often. I smiled when expected. I filled in gaps when necessary, quietly so no one felt uncomfortable. I don't say this with resentment. At the time, it felt like harmony. In our marriage, I handled the invisible work. Calendars, follow-ups, emotional temperature checks. I remembered which topics tired him, which conversations he avoided, which truths made him uneasy. I adjusted accordingly. I told myself that was love, that attentiveness was generosity. What I didn't realize was how thoroughly that attentiveness erased me. When decisions were made about money, about plans, about priorities, they were usually framed as joint, but they arrived already shaped. He would say things like, "We talked about this," when what he meant was, "I explained this." If I hesitated, he'd reassure me gently, as if I were anxious rather than unconvinced. If I went quiet, it was taken as agreement, and I let it be. Not because I didn't notice, but because I had learned, long before him, that being easy was safer than being precise. Asking too many questions made people defensive. That certainty, especially quiet certainty, made others uncomfortable. So I became very good at appearing satisfied. To his family, I was the good match. Polite, low drama, grateful. They praised my patience, my calmness, my ability to handle him. That phrase came up often, as if he were a force of nature and I were the barrier that softened his edges. I smiled when they said it. I absorbed the implication that my role was containment. At work, I was efficient and behind the scenes. I didn't chase credit. I delivered results. Clients trusted me, but rarely tried to get to know me. They assumed I was content where I was. I didn't correct them. In retrospect, invisibility isn't something that happens suddenly. It's cumulative. It builds through small permissions you give others, permission to decide, to summarize you, to speak on your behalf. Over time, people stop asking who you are because they think they already know. My husband thought he knew me completely. He believed I was trusting to the point of naivete, that I didn't track details unless they were presented clearly, that my calmness meant acceptance, that my silence meant absence of thought. He believed I would notice only what he allowed me to notice. And because I never challenged that belief, it hardened into certainty. There's a particular loneliness in being underestimated by someone who sleeps beside you, not because they dislike you, but because they've never bothered to look closely, because they confuse kindness with passivity, patience with ignorance. I want to be clear. There were good moments, laughter, routines, shared mornings that felt real. This is not a story where everything was rotten from the start. It's a story about misalignment, about how being seen as easy can slowly become being seen as inconsequential. At that stage, I still believed the marriage was fundamentally honest, that whatever small discomforts existed were normal adjustments. I believed that if something truly mattered, I would feel it sharply. What I didn't yet understand was that the sharpest things often arrive quietly, disguised as small dismissals, as moments that pass without comment. And those moments were already happening. I just hadn't named them yet. The first moment didn't feel important when it happened. That's why it stayed with me. It was ordinary. A conversation in the kitchen on a weekday evening, the kind that happens while one person scrolls and the other unloads the dishwasher. He was telling me about a decision he'd made at work, one that would affect our schedule for the next few months. Travel, late nights, a shift in income timing. He spoke casually, confidently, already past the point of deliberation. I remember pausing with a plate in my hands and saying, "I didn't know you were considering that." He didn't look up. He smiled slightly and said, "Yeah, I mentioned it before. You were fine with it." The words landed softly, almost kindly, but something in me went still. I replayed the previous weeks in my head, the conversations we'd had, the moments where this might have come up. I couldn't find it. Not clearly. There was no memory of discussion, no moment of agreement, just his certainty, and my sudden uncertainty about my own recall. I didn't argue. I didn't correct him. I told myself it was possible I'd forgotten, that stress had blurred things, that he wouldn't lie about something so small. So I nodded. "Okay," I said, and put the plate away. That was the cut. Not because of the decision itself, but because of what followed. Over the next few days, I noticed how easily the narrative had shifted. When he spoke to others, he said, "We decided," or "Quinn's on board." When I hesitated later, asked about logistics, timing, impact, he reassured me again, calmly, patiently, as if I were catching up to something already settled. No one else noticed anything wrong. When I mentioned it casually to a friend, how fast the decision had moved, she laughed and said, "That's just how he is. You know he thinks things through." The implication was clear. If I felt surprised, it was because I'd missed something, not because something had been withheld. That night, lying in bed, I tried to locate the feeling precisely. It wasn't anger, it wasn't fear. It was a faint disorientation, the sense that the floor had shifted by an inch, just enough to make balance conscious. I started paying attention after that, not in an accusatory way, in a quiet, internal way. I noticed how often he referenced conversations I didn't remember, how frequently decisions appeared fully formed with my agreement assumed, how smoothly he reframed my questions as anxieties. "You worry too much," he'd say affectionately. "It's already handled." Each instance on its own was insignificant, easy to dismiss, but together they formed a pattern that made me uneasy, not about him exactly, but about my role, about how easily my perspective was overwritten. Still, I said nothing. Part of me believed that naming it would make it real, that questioning him would create tension where none was needed to exist. Another part of me worried that I was, in fact, overthinking, that this was what compromise looked like in long-term relationships. One person moves faster, the other adapts. But adaptation has a cost when it's one-directional. The cut deepened, not through repetition, but through normalization. When something happens once, you question it. When it happens again, you adjust. When it becomes routine, you stop noticing it as an event and start accepting it as context. I remember a moment weeks later, standing with him at a social event, when someone asked me about an upcoming plan. Before I could answer, he spoke for me, not rudely, not loudly, just efficiently, as if it were helpful. I smiled again. Inside, I felt that same stillness. It would be easy, looking back, to dramatize this moment, to say I knew then that something was wrong. I didn't. I only knew that something small had been taken from me, something subtle but essential. The authority over my own memory, the right to say, "That's not how I remember it," without being smoothed into silence. That first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't scar visibly. But it taught me something important, that my silence made room for other people's certainty. And once that room exists, it rarely stays empty. Once the first cut is absorbed, the body adapts. I didn't think of it that way then, of course. At the time, it felt like maturity, like learning how to choose peace. I told myself that relationships weren't about keeping score, that harmony required flexibility. And because nothing catastrophic had happened, I assumed nothing truly harmful was happening either. The moments kept coming. He would interrupt me mid-sentence, not sharply, not impatiently, but with the ease of someone confident the floor belonged to him. If I stopped speaking, he didn't notice. If I resumed, he smiled as if indulging me. "Sorry, go on," he'd say, already glancing at his phone. When I offered opinions that differed from his, he didn't argue. He reframed. "You're thinking emotionally," he'd say gently, or "you're missing a piece of the context." Sometimes he'd nod along, agree in theory, and then proceed exactly as he'd planned. Later he'd say, "This is what we talked about," and I'd feel that same faint disorientation again. Around others, it became more pronounced. At dinners, he told stories that included me, but as a supporting detail. I was the one who keeps things running, the organized one, the calm anchor. Compliments that felt oddly constricting. They left no room for contradiction, no space for complexity. I was being pressed into a corner. If I corrected a detail, small things like timelines or facts, he laughed it off. "See, this is why I love her," he'd say, always with the footnotes. People laughed. The moment passed. I stayed quiet. I learned quickly which corrections were welcomed and which made the room uncomfortable. So I chose silence more often. Not because I didn't know, but because I didn't want to be perceived as difficult. That's how disrespect becomes normalized, not through cruelty, but through convenience. I rationalize constantly. He's under pressure. He doesn't mean it that way. He trusts me enough to speak freely. These explanations were soothing. They allowed me to remain generous in my interpretation of his behavior, even as my own presence thinned. What I didn't acknowledge was the cumulative effect. Each dismissal taught me that my timing was always slightly off, that my contributions were optional, that my agreement was assumed, but my dissent required justification. Over time, I started pre-editing myself, shortening sentences, softening statements, abandoning points before they reached my mouth. I became very good at anticipating what would be ignored. There was a moment, small but telling, when I caught myself apologizing for asking a clarifying question about our finances. Not because the question was unreasonable, but because his sigh told me it was inconvenient. He answered, "Of course," patiently, with just enough condescension to make me feel childish. Afterward, I felt embarrassed. Not of him, but of myself. That's the danger. When disrespect is subtle, it doesn't provoke anger. It provokes self-correction. You start asking less, expecting less, shrinking your needs to fit the available space. Everyone else seemed comfortable with the arrangement. Friends praised our dynamic. "You balance him," they said. "You're good for him." As if my purpose were regulation, as if the marriage were a system where his expansion required my compression. I told myself that love involved compromise, that not every thought needed to be voiced, that being heard wasn't the same as being valued. But there's a difference between choosing silence and being trained into it. I still believed at that point that my patience would eventually be recognized, that if I stayed steady, stayed kind, stayed reasonable, the imbalance would correct itself, that he would notice the weight I carried and adjust accordingly. What I didn't yet understand was that people rarely question arrangements that benefit them. And why would he? From his perspective, everything worked. Decisions moved quickly, conflict was minimal. I was agreeable, supportive, and present. I absorbed uncertainty so he could remain certain. I smoothed the edges so he could move freely. The cost was invisible, especially to him, and so the disrespect continued, not as an escalation, but as a rhythm. Predictable, almost gentle, woven into daily life so seamlessly that naming it felt dramatic. I wasn't ready to name it yet, but something in me was quietly taking notes. Roles are rarely announced. They're inferred, reinforced, and eventually inhabited. By the time I recognized mine, I had been playing it for years. I was the reliable one, the emotional buffer, the woman who could be counted on to adapt without complaint. When plans changed, I adjusted. When tensions rose, I softened them. When something went wrong, I absorbed the inconvenience so it didn't ripple outward. At first, that felt like competence. But competence, when unreciprocated, quietly becomes an obligation. In our marriage, my role was never debated. It was assumed. I handled the background logistics of our shared life. Scheduling, follow-ups, remembering details that kept things running smoothly. He handled the visible decisions, the big picture thinking, the forward motion. When people described our dynamic, they spoke as if it were complementary, balanced. It wasn't. Balance implies exchange. This was an allocation. When something needed emotional labor, it came to me. When something needed explanation, it came to him. If there was tension between us, it was mine to manage. If there was success, it was ours. But his name was the one remembered. I began to notice how often my role was invoked when it was convenient. "You're better at this than I am," he'd say, handing me a task he didn't want to handle. "You don't mind, right?" Already halfway out the door. "You're so calm about these things," when I swallowed disappointment instead of expressing it. Each statement sounded like appreciation, but appreciation that only flows in one direction eventually reveals itself as expectation. I wasn't asked what I wanted. Not explicitly. It was assumed that what I wanted aligned with what kept things smooth, that my satisfaction came from functionality, not fulfillment. And I reinforced that belief by complying. There's a particular kind of invisibility that comes from being too good at your role. When you perform it flawlessly, people stop noticing it as labor. They stop imagining alternatives. The role becomes your identity. At some point, I realized that people describe me in the same narrow way, regardless of context: calm, supportive, understanding. No one asked what frustrated me. No one asked what I was building for myself. Even I stopped asking. The most unsettling realization wasn't that others had assigned me this role. It was that I had accepted it without negotiation. I told myself it was temporary, that once things stabilized, once the next phase passed, there would be room for recalibration. But stability has a way of extending itself indefinitely when someone else is doing the stabilizing. In private moments, I sometimes felt a flicker of resistance, a thought I didn't voice, a preference I didn't state. I noticed how quickly I dismissed my own impulses as impractical or disruptive. I had internalized the idea that wanting more clarity, more reciprocity, more presence was unreasonable. That's how roles maintain themselves, not through enforcement, but through internal compliance. My husband wasn't cruel. That's important to say. He didn't demand my silence. He simply benefited from it. And because I delivered it consistently, he assumed it was freely given. There's a moment I remember clearly. We were discussing a future plan, vague, long-term, framed as someday. He spoke at length about what made sense, what was realistic, and what aligned with our trajectory. When he finished, he looked at me and said, "Right?" It wasn't a question, it was a cue. I hesitated, just long enough to feel the weight of the role press in. Then I nodded, again. That nod cost me something, not immediately, but over time. Because every role you accept shapes the range of futures available to you. I didn't know it then, but that was the phase where something inside me began to disengage, not emotionally, but strategically. I started observing the role from the outside, not resisting it yet, just studying its contours, its limits, its assumptions. I was still playing the part, but I was no longer fully inside it. There was no argument, no discovery, no dramatic reveal. The shift happened on a morning that looked exactly like every other morning. It was early. The light in the apartment was soft, still undecided about the day. He was getting ready for work, moving quickly, already mentally elsewhere. I was sitting at the table with my coffee, scanning emails, half listening to him talk about his schedule. He mentioned something in passing, a detail about an upcoming commitment that directly contradicted what he'd told me the week before. Not in a big way, just enough to be inconsistent. Normally, I would have corrected him, or asked a clarifying question, or quietly adjusted my expectations. This time I did none of those things. I looked up and asked very simply, "When did that change?" He paused, just briefly, then said, "We talked about it." The sentence was familiar, almost reflexive. Something in me settled. I didn't argue. I didn't search my memory. I didn't try to reconcile timelines. I didn't feel the usual flicker of self-doubt. Instead, I noticed his posture, the ease with which the phrase came out, the certainty, the assumption that it would end the conversation. And I understood, with an unexpected clarity, that this wasn't about memory at all. It was about narrative control. For the first time, I saw the pattern without trying to soften it, without assigning benevolent intent, without asking what I might have done differently to deserve it. I saw it as a mechanism, efficient, habitual, unexamined. He wasn't lying in the dramatic sense. He was editing, revising, collapsing time and conversation into whatever version served the moment. And he assumed I would accept it. I took a sip of my coffee and said, "Okay." But internally, something disengaged. Not with anger, with precision. It felt like stepping back from a painting you'd been standing too close to. The image didn't change, but your understanding of it did. I could see the brushstrokes now, the repeated techniques, the way the same phrases appeared whenever clarity threatened convenience. I didn't confront him because there was nothing to confront. Not yet. Confrontation would have returned us to the familiar dynamic. His reassurance, my doubt. His confidence, my adjustment. Instead, I became still. That morning, after he left, I sat at the table longer than usual. I replayed past moments, not to accuse, but to observe. I noticed how often certainty had flowed in one direction, how often my questions had been reframed as emotional responses, how rarely my version of events had been treated as definitive. And I realized something else, equally important. He had no idea I was capable of seeing this. He believed my calmness was absent, that my patience was passive, that my silence meant trust. He didn't know that I noticed inconsistencies, tracked patterns, and remembered details long after conversations ended. He didn't know that observation was my default state. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel grounded, as if I'd finally located myself again, not as a role, but as a witness. From that day on, I stopped trying to correct the narrative in real time. I stopped chasing alignment through conversation. I stopped offering immediate reactions. Instead, I listened. I let him speak without interruption. I let plans unfold without commentary. I let assumptions surface without challenge. And in doing so, I learned more than I ever had by engaging. This wasn't a withdrawal, it was a recalibration. I began to distinguish between silence as avoidance and silence as choice, between patience as endurance and patience as positioning. The shift wasn't visible to anyone else, not to him, not to friends, not even to me. Outwardly, my behavior didn't change dramatically. I still nodded, still smiled, still fulfilled my role. But internally, I had stopped negotiating with uncertainty. I wasn't confused anymore. And once confusion leaves, clarity has a way of demanding action, just not immediately. Once you realize your silence is being interpreted as agreement, you're faced with a decision. You can fill the space with noise, explanations, objections, emotional appeals, or you can let the space speak for itself. I chose the second, not because it was easier, but because it was more revealing. At first, nothing seemed different. I still responded when spoken to, I still participated in daily routines, but I stopped volunteering clarifications, I stopped smoothing over contradictions. When he revised the past in small ways, I didn't correct him, I noted it. He mistook this for trust. I could see the relief on his face, the ease. Without my questions, things moved faster. Plans were finalized without friction. Decisions flowed uninterrupted. He began speaking with even more confidence, as if the absence of resistance confirmed his authority. What he didn't realize was that my silence had shifted its function. Before, it had been protective of the relationship, of harmony, of his comfort. Now, it was diagnostic. I was watching how far the narrative would drift if left unchecked. How often would assumptions replace conversation? How quickly my consent would be implied rather than requested? The results were immediate. He spoke more, explained less. He referenced conversations that had never happened with increasing ease. He summarized my opinions instead of asking for them, and when I didn't object, he took that as confirmation that he understood me completely. There's a particular confidence people develop when they believe they're unobserved. I noticed how his tone changed when he thought I wasn't tracking details. How casually he contradicted himself from one week to the next. How little effort he put into consistency once he assumed I wouldn't question it. And I noticed something else. When I did speak, briefly, precisely, he listened differently. Not because my words carried more weight, but because they were rarer. He'd pause, recalibrate, sometimes even backtrack. Then quickly, he'd regain footing and continue as before. It was confirmation of what I already suspected. The imbalance wasn't accidental. It was functional. I started documenting, not in a dramatic way, just notes, dates, statements, changes. Not because I planned to confront him with them, but because I needed an external anchor, something to counter the subtle gaslighting that had crept into our dynamic. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about maintaining my own orientation. Silence gave me clarity. It removed the emotional static. Without constant engagement, I could see patterns more clearly. I could separate what he said from what he did, what he promised from what materialized. And I could see how little space there was for me in his version of our life. People often think silence is weakness because they associate strength with volume. But silence, when chosen, is a form of control. It slows things down. It forces others to reveal themselves. It creates a vacuum where assumptions rush in, and assumptions are informative. I didn't feel angry. I felt focused. Friends commented on how easy things seemed between us lately. Less tension, they said. More flow. I smiled and agreed. From the outside, the marriage looked smoother than ever. Inside, I was no longer participating in the illusion. I began redirecting my energy, not into fixing the relationship, but into stabilizing myself. I paid closer attention to my finances, my legal documents, my professional independence, quiet, practical things that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with me. He didn't notice. Why would he? From his perspective, nothing was wrong. In fact, things were better. I wasn't questioning, I wasn't pushing back, I wasn't asking for reassurance or clarification. He assumed I had finally settled. What he couldn't see was that my silence wasn't acceptance anymore. It was preparation. There's a strange freedom that comes when people stop paying close attention to you. Once I settled fully into silence, not the fragile kind, but the deliberate kind, the scrutiny disappeared. My husband stopped checking in altogether. Friends stopped asking how things were beyond the surface. The role I'd been assigned, reliable, steady, unproblematic, had reached its final form. And inside that invisibility, I began preparing, not in secretive ways, in plain sight. That was the irony. Everything I did was reasonable, explainable, and boring enough to be ignored. I updated the files, organized documents, revisited accounts I hadn't looked at closely in years. I asked neutral questions of professionals, accountants, advisors, colleagues, framing them as general curiosity, long-term planning. No one raised an eyebrow. I started noticing how much information I already had simply from years of listening. Dates, patterns, habits, discrepancies, not dramatic betrayals, structural ones. Places where stories didn't align, where timelines shifted conveniently, where explanations were smooth but thin. I didn't jump to conclusions. I cross-referenced. I learned to trust my method instead of my feelings. Feelings fluctuate, patterns don't. At night, when he talked about work, about plans, about frustrations, I listened without reacting. I let him fill the space. People reveal more when they think they're uninterrupted, especially when they believe they're understood without effort. I wrote things down later, not immediately. I didn't want the act itself to carry emotion, just data. There was no sense of urgency. That's what surprised me most. Once clarity arrived, panic left. I wasn't scrambling to fix anything. I was building a map. What no one noticed, especially him, was that I had always been capable of this level of attention. I just hadn't turned it inward before. I hadn't prioritized my own orientation. The more I observed, the more I realized how much of the marriage had been built on my labor, emotional, logistical, cognitive, and how little of that labor had been acknowledged as such. It wasn't malicious. It was efficient. He'd learned that things worked better when I absorbed complexity. So he kept handing it to me, and I kept accepting it outwardly. Internally, I began repositioning myself. I clarified boundaries quietly. I separated responsibilities that had been blurred. I stopped covering for inconsistencies in social settings, not by correcting him, but by not stepping in. When he misstated something about our plans, I let it stand. When others looked at me for confirmation, I smiled neutrally. That alone shifted dynamics. People began asking him follow-up questions instead of assuming I'd smooth things out. He noticed that, briefly, then dismissed it. I also noticed how often he spoke in absolutes, how certain he was that I wouldn't leave. that I wouldn't disrupt the structure we'd built, that my calmness equaled contentment. That assumption became the most valuable information of all. Preparation doesn't require secrecy, it requires patience and clarity. It requires resisting the urge to be seen while you're still assembling yourself. I didn't confront him because confrontation would have forced me to act before I was ready, before I understood the full scope of what I was dealing with, before I had options. Instead, I gave myself time. Time to understand my financial position independent of his narrative. Time to examine legal realities without emotional framing. Time to assess what I wanted, not in reaction to him, but in alignment with myself. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't even planning departure yet. I was planning sovereignty. And that kind of planning is invisible to people who only notice noise. The truth is, most people don't lose power because someone takes it from them. They lose it because they assume it was never there to begin with. My husband assumed that about me. So did everyone else. That assumption gave me space. The reveal didn't come with a sound. No message popping up at the wrong time, no overheard phone call, no confession forced by circumstance. It arrived quietly, the way truth often does when you finally stop looking away from it. By then, I wasn't searching for proof. I was verifying alignment. I had been reviewing documents, old ones, recent ones, things that should have matched but didn't quite. Dates were off. Descriptions were vague where they should have been specific. There were omissions that, taken alone, meant nothing. Together, they formed a negative space too consistent to ignore. What struck me wasn't the content itself. It was the timeline. The lie, if you could call it that, wasn't a single event. It was a foundation, something established before the wedding, then quietly maintained afterward. Adjusted, reframed, protected. I remember sitting alone in the apartment, late afternoon light slanting across the floor, holding that realization without reacting to it. My body didn't tense. My breath didn't change. I felt settled. That's how I knew it was real. When something finally fits the pattern you've been observing, it doesn't feel shocking. It feels explanatory. It answers questions you stopped asking out loud. I didn't feel betrayed in the cinematic sense. There was no rush of anger, no urge to confront him immediately. What I felt was clarity about the marriage itself, about why certain conversations never went anywhere, why transparency always felt partial. Why has my role been containment rather than partnership? The marriage started with a secret, not a dramatic one. Not something that would make headlines or draw gasps if told at a dinner party, but a secret significant enough to shape the power dynamic from the beginning, significant enough that full honesty would have changed my consent. And he knew that. That was the part that mattered. He hadn't lied impulsively. He'd curated. He'd decided what version of himself was safe to offer and what details could be managed later. He'd trusted that time, routine, and my temperament would do the rest. In that moment, I didn't feel small. I felt correctly oriented. I didn't celebrate the discovery. There was nothing to celebrate. Leverage isn't exciting when it involves your own life. It's sobering. It forces responsibility. Once you know something, you're accountable for how you act on it. I didn't confront him because confrontation would have been premature and noisy. It would have centered his reaction instead of my decision. I wasn't interested in watching him explain himself. I already understood the explanation. It had worked. Instead, I sat with the information and asked myself one question. What does this change? The answer wasn't immediate, but it was definitive. It changed how I interpreted the past. It changed how I understood his confidence. It changed how I saw my own patience. Not as tolerance, but as misapplied generosity. Most importantly, it changed what I owed him. I didn't owe him immediate disclosure. I didn't owe him reassurance. I didn't owe him the opportunity to reshape the narrative again. What I owed myself was a clean decision. That evening, he came home and talked as usual. About his day, about plans, about things that assume continuity. I listened, nodded, and responded minimally. Not because I was hiding something, but because nothing needed to be said yet. People imagine that knowing the truth creates urgency. In reality, it creates stillness, a kind of internal quiet where you stop negotiating with uncertainty. I slept well that night. The next days passed normally. Too normal. He remained unaware. Why wouldn't he? From his perspective, the structure held. I was still playing my role, still calm, still present. But the meaning of everything had shifted. The reveal didn't change my behavior overnight. It changed my internal posture. I was no longer reacting within the marriage. I was deciding outside of it. And that difference between reaction and decision is where quiet dominance lives. Knowing something and deciding what to do with it are two different states. For a while, I stayed suspended between them. I didn't rush myself. I didn't dramatize the choice. I let the information settle into my body, into my routines, into the way I saw the future. I needed to understand not just what was possible, but what was irreversible. There were, in theory, several options. I could confront him, lay out what I knew, ask for explanations, apologies, and restructuring. That path was familiar. It would invite conversation, negotiation, and emotional labor. It would also give him something he'd always been skilled at, the opportunity to manage perception. I could stay, accept the secret as part of the architecture, reframe it as something forgivable, manageable, survivable. Many people do this. They tell themselves that stability is more important than truth, that no marriage is built on complete honesty. I could leave quietly, without confrontation, without explanation beyond what was necessary. That option felt drastic, not because it was extreme, but because it was final. I examined each one carefully. Confrontation required trust in his capacity for full transparency. Staying required trust in my ability to live with partial truth. Leaving required trust in myself. That was the deciding factor. For most of my life, I had extended trust outward, toward partners, systems, and expectations. I had assumed that clarity would come from dialogue, that fairness would be reciprocated, that patience would eventually be met with care. But the private reveal had clarified something essential. The structure of the marriage relied on my willingness to remain flexible in the face of asymmetry. Any attempt to fix it would require me to continue doing that work. I didn't want to manage the lie. I wanted to exit the system that made it viable. The decision didn't arrive as a dramatic vow. It arrived as a quiet sentence in my mind. This cannot continue. Not because it was unbearable, but because it was misaligned. I noticed how calm I felt once that sentence settled, how the mental back and forth stopped, how my energy consolidated instead of dispersing into hypothetical conversations and imagined outcomes. I didn't feel fear. I felt resolved. The irreversible choice wasn't leaving. It was choosing not to explain myself into a smaller position again. I gave myself a timeline, not rigid, but intentional. Time to prepare without rushing, time to ensure that when I moved, I would not need to reverse course, that I would not need permission. He sensed nothing. That, too, was information. He spoke about future plans with confidence, made assumptions about next year, eventually, when things settle. He spoke as if the path ahead were fixed, inevitable. I listened without correcting him, not because I was deceiving him, but because I was no longer participating in shared projection. My future had quietly diverged. I began letting go internally, of expectations, of shared narratives, of the idea that he needed to understand my reasoning in order for it to be valid. I rehearsed nothing. I planned no speeches. The decision was already made. What remained was execution. There's a particular clarity that comes when you accept that you cannot carry both truth and harmony in the same structure. Something has to give. I chose harmony with myself. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt adult. And adulthood, I was learning, isn't about endurance. It's about discernment. Once the decision was made, the noise stopped. Not around me, inside me. There was no more internal debate, no more rehearsing conversations that would never happen. The energy that had once been spent interpreting, accommodating, and recalibrating was suddenly available for something else. Execution. I moved carefully, not secretly, deliberately. Silence at this stage wasn't avoidance, it was containment. I understood that once motion became visible, it couldn't be undone. So I let my actions remain unremarkable. Administrative. I separated finances quietly, framing it as an organization. Ization. Updated records, made copies, asked neutral questions that raised no suspicion. I scheduled appointments during lunch hours. I learned which documents mattered and which were symbolic. I learned the difference between shared access and shared control. He didn't notice. Why would he? These were the kinds of things I had always handled. Logistics were my domain. Competence, once established, becomes invisible. I also prepared emotionally, not by detaching, but by stabilizing. I stopped seeking moments of connection as reassurance. I let conversations stay surface level, not cold, just contained. I observed how little effort it took for the relationship to continue functioning without depth. That observation mattered. It told me that the marriage had already been running on momentum, that my presence had been more structural than relational for some time. Removing myself wouldn't cause an immediate collapse, just a delayed one. And that delay was significant. I didn't change my routines abruptly. I didn't withdraw affection dramatically. I understood that disruption would invite questions, and questions would invite management. I wasn't interested in being managed. So I remained consistent, predictable, calm. People often think that power announces itself, that it needs visibility to function. In reality, power consolidates quietly. It waits until movement is decisive. Each step I took reduced my dependence on explanation, reduced the number of permissions I would need later, reduced the chances that I'd be pulled back into negotiation. There was a strange tenderness in this phase, not toward him, but toward myself. I moved with care. I didn't rush. I didn't punish myself for not having seen the truth sooner. I treated the process like something delicate that needed steady hands. Occasionally, I caught him looking at me as if noticing something, but he never followed the thought. He trusted the pattern. Trusted that I would speak if something were wrong. Trusted that silence meant continuity. I let him keep that belief, not out of malice, out of clarity. Because clarity doesn't require confession, it requires alignment between intention and action, and my actions were aligned now. I also noticed how differently I held myself. Straighter, quieter, less reactive. When things went wrong, minor irritations, misunderstandings, I no longer absorbed them as personal failures. They were just data points in a system I was exiting. That internal shift changed everything. Moving in silence isn't about... It's about not leaking intention before the structure is ready. It's ready. It's about understanding that some decisions lose their power if they're explained too early. By the time I was done preparing, there would be nothing left to debate. Only facts. Only outcomes. And that, I knew, would be enough. Consequences rarely arrive all at once. They start as absences, as small disruptions in systems that once ran smoothly without anyone noticing who maintained them. At first, they're attributed to bad timing, stress, external pressure, anything but cause. I saw the first signs before he did. Things he'd never had to think about began slipping. Appointments missed, details overlooked. Minor inconveniences that used to resolve themselves now lingered. He mentioned them casually at first, half joking. I don't know why everything feels harder lately. I nodded, listened, said nothing. What he didn't realize was that nothing had become harder. It had simply stopped being handled for him. I hadn't withdrawn suddenly. I had withdrawn precisely. I stopped preempting, stopped compensating, stopped smoothing transitions before they became visible. The work I had always done quietly was now simply undone. And the system began to show strain. At work, he was distracted. At home, slightly irritable. He couldn't articulate why. From his perspective, the inputs hadn't changed. I was still there, still calm, still agreeable. The structure looked intact. But function depends on more than structure. It depends on maintenance. Friends began noticing small things, too. conversations that felt unfinished, plans that didn't quite land, moments where he seemed oddly unmoored. They asked me if everything was okay. I said yes, and it was true in the only way that mattered to me. He began asking questions, not directly, not clearly. They came sideways. Did I forget something this week? Did we talk about that already? You seem quieter than usual. Each question was each one is an invitation to re-enter the familiar dynamic. Reassure, clarify, realign. Realign. I declined gently, not by refusing, but by answering exactly what was asked, no more. I don't know. I don't remember. I'm just tired. All true? All insufficient? The more he reached for certainty, the less I supplied it. And without my reinforcement, his confidence began to fray, not dramatically, but noticeably. He started double-checking himself, repeating stories, asking for confirmation after the fact. He wasn't panicking yet. He was disoriented. That's the thing about consequences when they begin quietly. They feel like internal failures, like personal lapses. He didn't suspect me. He suspected himself, his memory, his judgment, his capacity to keep things running. And in a way, that was fair, because the version of himself he'd built relied on my silent participation. Without it, the edges showed. I watched this with a strange detachment. Not coldness, distance. I wasn't observing him as a partner anymore. I was observing a system responding to the removal of an unacknowledged support. The consequences weren't punitive, they were proportional. I hadn't confronted him. I hadn't accused him. I hadn't exposed anything. I had simply stopped compensating for a structure that was never reciprocal. And that was enough. One evening, he said something that stayed with me. We were sitting in the living room, both on our phones, not really together. I feel like I'm losing my footing, he said. Not dramatically, almost thoughtfully. Like I used to know where everything stood. I looked at him. For a moment, I considered telling him the truth. Not the whole truth, but enough to reorient him, enough to restore balance. Then I remembered why balance had never held in the first place. So I said, maybe things are just changing. He nodded slowly, as if that explained something. It did, just not in the way he thought. The consequences continued, not as punishment, but as revelation. They showed him what had been holding things together all along. And they showed me how little was required, once I stepped back, for the illusion of control to unravel. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt confirmed. By the time he realized something was truly wrong, he was already behind it. That's the thing about systems built on unspoken labor. They don't fail loudly. They fray, and by the time the damage is visible, the person who kept everything aligned has already stepped away. His tone changed. They were no longer casual or sideways. They became careful, measured. He started asking how I felt, not in the abstract, but with a new attentiveness, as if searching for a missing manual. "You've been distant," he said one night. Not accusing, observing. "I'm here," I replied. Also true. He tried to reintroduce conversations we'd never had, brought up us in vague, future-oriented terms, suggested time away, therapy, a reset, all reasonable proposals, if they had come earlier, if they hadn't assumed that I was still available for repair. What he didn't understand was that my silence was no longer a signal, it was a conclusion. When he spoke now, I heard urgency underneath the calm, not fear exactly, concern. The concern of someone who senses loss but doesn't yet understand its shape. He was trying to locate the moment where things had gone wrong so he could return to it. But there was no moment. There was a pattern. And patterns don't reverse themselves because someone notices them late. I could see him trying to be more transparent, offering details he'd never volunteered before, explaining decisions instead of announcing them, checking in where he used to assume. These changes might have mattered once. Now they felt like translations, attempts to speak a language after the conversation had moved on. I didn't punish him for the timing. I simply didn't re-enter. There's a difference between refusing repair and being beyond it. I wasn't withholding. I had already resolved. The emotional work he was now willing to do was the work I'd done alone for years, and I was finished. He grew frustrated, not with me, but with the lack of traction. Effort without response feels like futility. He couldn't tell whether he was making things better or worse. That uncertainty unsettled him. One evening, he asked directly, "Do you still want this?" I looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he shifted uncomfortably, long enough that I could see the hope forming, the assumption that the question itself would prompt reassurance. "I want honesty," I said. He nodded quickly. "I know, I'm trying." And that was when I understood how completely misaligned we were. Because I wasn't asking for future honesty, I was accounting for past absence. Trying now didn't change what had already been built on omission. It didn't change the fact that the marriage started with a secret. It didn't change the years of narrative control that had shaped our dynamic. It was too late, not because he was incapable of change, but because change requires consent, and mine was no longer available. He became restless, more attentive in bursts, less certain in his footing. He sensed the imbalance but couldn't name it. And without a name, he couldn't address it. That's when people start bargaining, with time, with effort, with promises. I listened without reacting, not because I was indifferent, but because I was done translating my clarity into something he could work with. I didn't owe him that labor anymore. The hardest part wasn't watching him struggle. It was resisting the instinct to help, to guide, to soften that instinct had been trained into me over the years. Years. Letting go of it was an act of discipline. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't cold. I was simply unavailable for reconstruction. And availability, I was learning, is not something you can demand once it's been withdrawn. The confrontation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a climax. It felt like a formality. There was no raised voice, no list of grievances, no dramatic unveiling of evidence. By the time we sat down to talk, really talk, everything that mattered had already been decided internally. We were sitting across from each other at the table, the same table where so many conversations had ended before they began. He looked tired, not defensive, not angry, just worn down by uncertainty. "I feel like I don't know where I stand with you," he said. I nodded. "That makes sense." He blinked, surprised, not by the words, but by the lack of resistance. He had come prepared for an argument, or reassurance. Either would have given him something to work with. Calm neutrality gave him nothing. "I've been trying," he continued. "I know I haven't always gotten things right, but I'm here now. I want to fix this." I listened, fully, without interrupting, without correcting his framing. I let him say everything he needed to say. When he finished, the room was quiet. "I need to tell you something," I said. My voice was steady, not rehearsed, just clear. The marriage started with a secret. His posture changed immediately, not dramatically, subtly, as if a word had landed somewhere precise. I didn't accuse him. I didn't name the details. I didn't need to. What mattered wasn't the content. It was the acknowledgement. "You decided what I needed to know," I continued. "And you built everything after that on the assumption that I wouldn't notice, or that if I did, I would adapt." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I could see him calculating how much to deny, how much to explain, how much to minimize. I didn't give him the chance. "This isn't about whether you can explain it," I said. "It's about the fact that I didn't get to consent to the truth." The word consent changed. He tried then to contextualize, to soften, to frame it as fear or protection or timing. Timing. He said he hadn't wanted to lose me, that he planned to tell me eventually, that it didn't change how he felt. I believed him, and it still didn't matter. "I don't doubt that you care," I said, "but care without honesty isn't partnership, it's management." That was when he understood. Not everything, but enough. I wasn't angry. That unsettled him more than anger would have. Anger invites defense. Calm invites reckoning. "I'm not asking for apologies," I said, "and I'm not interested in repairing something that required me to be smaller in order to function." He asked then, quietly, if this meant I was leaving. "Yes," I said. No ultimatum, no conditions, no timeline presented as leverage, just a statement of fact. He looked at me as if seeing me clearly for the first time, not as the calm one, not as the reliable one, but as someone autonomous, decisive, unavailable. I didn't feel powerful in that moment. I felt aligned. The confrontation ended without drama. We discussed logistics briefly, practically, respectfully. There were pauses. There was discomfort, but there was no chaos. When it was over, I realized something important. This was the first conversation we'd had where I wasn't adjusting myself to preserve the outcome. And it was the last one we would have as a couple. After I left, nothing dramatic happened. No sudden glow up, no public reinvention, no rush to explain myself to people who hadn't really seen me to begin with. Life didn't explode, it simplified. That's how I knew I'd chosen correctly. For a while, I lived very quietly, not in hiding, just without narration. I let routines form that were mine alone. Mornings without negotiation, evenings without emotional accounting. Decisions that didn't require translation or justific. What surprised me most was how much energy was returned. Eterned. Not emotional energy, mental energy. The kind that had been tied up for years in monitoring tone, managing outcomes, and smoothing interactions before they could become uncomfortable. Without that background process running constantly, my mind felt spacious. I noticed things again. My own preferences. My own pace. The difference between calm and suppression. People who hadn't known me well said I seemed the same, calm, composed, steady. People who had known me well said I seemed clearer. I didn't rush to correct anyone. Who I am now isn't louder than who I was before. I don't take up more space socially. I don't perform confidence or narrate growth. The change is structural, not aesthetic. I no longer confuse patience with self-erasure. I don't accept roles by default. When expectations appear, I examine them. When someone assumes access to my labor, emotional or otherwise, I notice, and noticing, I've learned, is often enough to change the trajectory. The most important shift is internal. I trust my orientation. I don't second-guess memory when something feels inconsistent. I don't require external validation to name misalignment. I don't explain myself into clarity anymore. I act from it. That doesn't mean I'm closed or guarded. It means I'm precise. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you will leave situations that require you to disappear in order to function. That confidence doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It shows up in what you tolerate and what you don't. I still believe in love, in partnership, in commitment. But I no longer believe that endurance is the same as integrity, or that harmony built on silence is worth preserving. The woman I am now would not have stayed as long as I did, but she wouldn't judge the woman who did. That woman was learning, paying attention, surviving with the tools she had at the time. And when she learned better, she did better, quietly, cleanly, without needing permission. That, to me, is strength. Not domination over another person, but sovereignty over oneself. There's a temptation, when a story like this ends, to look for villains and victories. I understand that impulse. It gives shape to pain. It makes the outcome feel justified. But that's not what this story's meant to offer. What happened to me wasn't a collapse. It was a correction. The lie mattered, not because it was shocking, but because it set the terms of the relationship without my informed consent. And once you understand that, the rest of the story becomes simpler. Not easier. Simpler. Quiet dominance isn't about control, it's about refusal. Refusing to participate in narratives that require you to doubt your own perception. Refusing to carry labor that's never acknowledged. Refusing to stay in systems that only work when you're smaller inside them. For a long time, I believed that being calm meant being safe, that patience would eventually be rewarded with reciprocity, that if I didn't make things difficult, I wouldn't become disposable. What I learned instead is that silence is neutral only until someone starts benefiting from it. After that, it becomes a currency, and if you don't decide how it's spent, someone else will. I don't regret loving him. I don't regret trying. What I regret is how long I postponed my own clarity out of consideration for someone else's comfort. Not because he demanded it, but because I assumed that was the price of stability. It isn't. Stability without truth is just repetition. The reason I'm sharing this now isn't to warn you away from marriage or commitment or trust. It's to remind you that noticing is not betrayal. Asking yourself hard questions doesn't make you disloyal. That leaving quietly without spectacle is still leaving with integrity. You don't owe explanations to people who benefited from your confusion. You don't owe endless chances to structures that required your silence to survive. And you don't need to be loud to be decisive. If there's a moral here, it's this. Pay attention to who you become quieter for, and whether that quiet is chosen or trained. Because the most dangerous lies aren't always spoken. Some are maintained by what you stop saying in order to keep things working. And one last thing. If you're in a place right now where something feels off, but you can't quite name it yet, don't rush yourself. Clarity doesn't demand immediacy. It asks for honesty, with yourself first. So I'll leave you with a question, not for answers, but for reflection. Have you ever realized, quietly, that a situation in your life only worked as long as you kept making yourself smaller inside it?